All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our clients and friends around the world. Thank you for joining us for another session, in our webinar series. We're very, very excited to welcome Bob and Shrutih to this, what's going to be a very, very exciting and dynamic session. I'd also like to let everyone know or remind everyone that we will have a Q&A at the end. So please take the time to ask your questions. You can add them to the chat below, and we will be sure to address as many as we can in the time allotted. We try to keep these to a very tight schedule for everyone's busy day. Also, I'd like to let everyone know that on April 24th, we're going to be joined by Anthony Scaramucci, which will also be a very, very dynamic discussion. Yiji Kroll will also be joining us. Jeremy is going to lead a discussion on private equity hedge fund outlook for current scenario and outlook going into the year. So we're looking forward to that as well. That's going to be on April 24th, and we'll be sending around an invitation to that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy, the head of Interfor Academy, to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Don, and hello, everybody. It's great to be back with you all again. I'm always excited about these webinar discussions. I think we have great topics, but I think this one in particular is going to be really fascinating. We have a seasoned member of the intelligence community and one of the country's leading national security lawyers as well. So we're going to have a great discussion on all things foreign policy. I think my only concern is that we're likely to run out of time with all of the seismic changes going on in the world at the moment and even just this week. So there's going to be plenty to discuss. Eager to jump into it, but let me introduce you to our panelists today. I'm going to start with Bob Grenier, who worked at the Central Intelligence Agency for 27 years. Bob's storied career saw him on the doorstep of history for much of his time with the CIA. As station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan on 9/11, Bob was directly involved in the early stages of the war on terrorism, as he recounts in his essential and fascinating memoir, 88 Days to Kandahar. Bob finished his intelligence career as head of the Counterterrorism Center, overseeing all U.S. counterterrorism efforts around the world. Today, he provides advice and assistance to governments, corporations, NGOs in the Middle East and South Asia. And I am also in debt to Bob for writing the fascinating foreword to my book, Sell Like a Spy. Hi, Bob. How are you today?
Good to be here.
Thanks, Bob. We're excited to have Shrutih Tewarie with us as well. Shrutih defends clients in cutting-edge criminal and regulatory investigations and has obtained multi-million-dollar victories for clients in high-stakes disputes before U.S. courts and international tribunals. She advises clients regarding compliance with laws impacting international trade and national security, including trade sanctions, export controls, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which we're going to discuss, and laws governing cross-border investments, including the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS. If you don't know CFIUS, you're going to get to know it a little bit more today. Hello, Shrutih. How are you?
Thanks, Jeremy. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you both with us. And, to kind of break the ice here, there's so much to discuss on the foreign policy landscape, and we'll get into more specifics, but both of you have such fascinating careers from different perspectives. I want to just kind of open the floor to both of you to give us a sense of how you're seeing things in this crazy year of 2025 that we've endured so far. So why don't you just share some thoughts to get started, and then I'll give you some specific questions. Bob, if you don't mind going first, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me just say a few very broad things about the current tenor of U.S. foreign policy. As you mentioned, Jeremy, I think we all have a certain sense of vertigo here as so the foreign policy world has been turned upside down. My observations really are in no way unique, but let me just hit on a few topics that I think will help us to frame the discussion a little bit. As is often pointed out, for the last 80 years or so, U.S. foreign relations have been dictated by adherence to what's sometimes referred to as the rules-based international order. And, in very broad outline, that features the inadmissibility of foreign conquest, respect for sovereignty, protection of the weak from the strong, with a commitment to a relatively free international trade regime. And the idea has always been that even if the U.S. had to sacrifice some of its interest in a tactical sense, that it would be in defense of a broad regime of international cooperation in which all would benefit, and the U.S. perhaps more than most. And I think that's played out pretty well over the last 80 years. What we've seen in the last 2 months is that all of that has been turned entirely upside down. And what the Trump administration seems to believe, and to some extent we have to intuit this from what they're doing, as opposed to working off of some sort of a doctrine, that there has been no doctrine that has been that's been elucidated here. But I think that we can say that very clearly the Trump administration sees U.S. interests in a much more narrow context, that they want to frame foreign policy decisions in the context of what is good for America in a fairly narrow sense. What's in it for us? And as we look at the situation, for instance, in Europe, that then means that the U.S. needs to make certain cost-benefit analyses on which our policies are then predicated. So, for instance, in the context of Ukraine, why would we want to incur the expense and the risks involved in defending Ukraine under circumstances where it's not at all clear what's precisely in it for us? And so if we look at this from the perspective of our European allies, if they think about this differently, if they think that they have a broad common interest in defending Ukraine or Estonia or Latvia, it's going to be over to them to carry that policy forward and to exert, among other things, the military power necessary in order to see that forward. The challenge for them is that they are not in a position to do that in the short term. So we will see whether they have the political will to see this through, but they're showing indications now that no, that they're going to want to build up their military power in a very rapid way. But under the best of circumstances, that's going to take years. And in the meantime, they're going to depend very much on at least some portion of the U.S. Defense umbrella remaining intact in order to see them through the interim. And then one of the big questions is going to be what cost will, to the extent that the U.S. is willing to do that, what will be the cost that we will extract? If we then shift things over to East Asia, it seems to me that it would be unrealistic to suppose that the U.S. is going to take an attitude toward the so-called freeloaders in East and Southeast Asia that's fundamentally different from the attitude that we bring to bear with the Europeans. So what does that then mean for our relations with China? And it's obviously the U.S. Many now say that China is our major potential antagonist, but it seems to me that there are two broad issues that we need to raise here. One is that the U.S. and this administration sees its interests very much revolving around trade and economics. Number two, they have a great deal more comfort, shall we say, with the idea that it's perfectly right and natural for the strong to dominate the weak. So we see that in the Western Hemisphere, which is our natural sphere of influence, where we can expect that the U.S. is going to use its leverage with countries like Greenland, like Canada, like Mexico, like Panama. And we can anticipate that this administration will feel similarly about the prerogatives of other great powers like Russia, like China. So if we think of U.S. foreign policy primarily in economic and trade terms, and if our major beef with China right now is that we think that we have a disadvantageous terms of trade, well, what sort of a deal might we strike with Xi Jinping under which we get more favorable terms of trade, and what will that then mean in terms of Chinese policy, or what we were willing to tolerate in terms of the Chinese using their natural advantages, their natural defense capabilities in their own neighborhood. So I think that maybe frames a few issues that we can discuss in a little bit more greater detail in certain contexts. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that sure does frame things up really well, Bob. Thanks so much. And I do hope in particular that we're able to come back to an area I've focused on a lot in my career on China. So, and I know Shrutih, you know a lot about that as well. So hopefully we find some time. Shrutih, I'll pass the mic over to you, and I'm excited to hear your take on things right now as well.
Thanks, Jeremy. I mean, I think, in terms of legal developments, to say that a lot has already happened in these, last 60 plus days, I think would be an understatement. I think just to kind of frame the issues, I'll start off by repeating a phrase that has been used fairly often by this administration in different contexts, right? Which is economic security is national security. And so, one way in which we've sort of seen that in action is that, and this has already been true in the last, 2 months or so, and I think it's very likely what we're going to continue to see going forward, is that this administration is going to use and has been using international trade and national security laws like economic sanctions, export controls, tariffs, even potentially anti-corruption laws like the FCPA, and we can get into this a little bit more shortly. And other laws to really drive this administration's foreign policy and national security agenda. And so, what does that mean for companies really all over the world? They're going to really need to find a way to stay on top of these issues, right? And I think the stock market is witness to this. These developments are really going to affect, companies' operations and their bottom lines. And it really used to be the case, I think maybe, a decade or so ago, perhaps, that these types of laws really only impacted a small minority of businesses, right, to some extent, maybe very large multinationals or companies that were operating in certain very high risk jurisdictions. And that's really changed. I mean, I think we've seen that changing really even under the past, administrations, as a result of an expansion of the scope and jurisdictional reach of some of these laws over the past, half a decade or so. But I think it's that fact coupled with how central these laws are really to driving this administration's agenda. I think it's really that fact that is going to make these laws sort of even more important for companies really all over the world to pay attention to them. The other thing I'll mention is that companies are really going to have to be aware of multi-jurisdictional issues, right? So for companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions, and I think this is true at this point, really for most companies around the world, right? Or even those that are thinking of entering new markets, they're really going to have to pay attention to instances where the U.S. policy and the U.S. law is diverging, or at least is different in some respects from the laws in the EU and other parts of the world. And I think, under the prior administration, under the Biden administration, there was really, I think, an effort, at least with some respects, right, in certain areas, to have a coordinated approach to something like, let's say, sanctions, right? We saw this in the Russia context. There was really an effort to have a coordinated response to, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the sanctions were, in many instances, coordinated. And I think now with this administration, there's much more, I think, a willingness and a tendency to want to go it alone, right? And so what that's going to mean is you'll have, different laws that you have to grapple with. In some instances, that they'll diverge. And also you'll see, when the United States sort of takes certain actions, such as, in the context of tariffs, right? You'll see some retaliatory action by our trading partners and even by, some of our allies. So I think there's going to be a lot to grapple with within this space for companies really all over the world.
Yeah, that's a great summary too. And economic security is national security. I mean, I don't know how they can talk about that with the markets fluctuating like they are and all of the craziness that we're experiencing. But I want to stay with you, Shrutih, for the first kind of direct topic that I want to go over. And you alluded to this, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And you and I co-authored a blog post, and I'm going to put that in the chat and encourage everybody to read the blog post. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is, as we talk about in the post, lawyers and in corporate investigators like us at Interfor were extremely busy starting in the mid to late 2000s as the FCPA was more directly enforced for reasons we discussed in the blog post. And there was a period of a ton of work in that way. And in recent years, and you and I, Shrutih, have talked about this, that has kind of faded. And that's because the law was so effective. And we had some of the coordination that you alluded to with our allies who realized that, corruption undermines democracy, undermines business. So you have the British Anti-Bribery Act, the Germans have a version, many countries do. So this suspension of the FCPA that the Trump administration has undertaken feels like a distinct step backwards. And I wonder if you could shed some light beyond what we have in the blog post, talk a little bit about FCPA, what you might, what are some of the highlights that we talk about, and what's your, I would like both of you guys to kind of help us, listeners, attendees, understand and kind of forecast a little bit more about what some of these things might mean for them.
Sure. And maybe just to give a little bit of background for those that may not be familiar with, what's happened. So, uh, uh, on February 10th, President Trump issued an executive order pausing enforcement of the FCPA for 180 days. And there were essentially two goals that were articulated in the executive order for the pause. The first was to, as the executive order puts it, restore proper bounds on FCPA enforcement. And the second is to preserve presidential foreign policy prerogatives. And the view that's articulated in the executive order is essentially that there has been an overexpansive use of the FCPA and enforcement of the FCPA against American citizens, against American businesses for what at least this executive order sees as routine business practices, right? In other countries all over the world, and that this is ultimately it's harming American competitiveness. It's hurting U.S. businesses because they're not able to compete as effectively as their counterparts are from other parts of the world because essentially they're not able to sort of pay the same bribes and kickbacks, right, that others that are not subject to FCP enforcement are. So I mean, I think taking a step back on some level, I think this argument that the FCPA hurts U.S. businesses, it's not really a novel argument. I mean, it's one that's been kicking around for a long time, really since this law came into force in the 1970s. But I think what it sort of ignores, right, is that the law is actually it has been very helpful to businesses, including U.S. businesses, right? And there are many reasons for this, and we talk about some of this in our blog post. But one of those reasons is that it used to be the case that U.S. companies could rely on the FCPA to really push back against significant kickbacks, right? And given the very broad jurisdictional reach of the FCPA, in many instances, even foreign companies, right, could rely on the FCPA to say, look, we can't do this, right? We can't pay this kickback. We can't pay this bribe. This is, the sort of convention that we're all operating under. And so the FCPA was really sort of a protective shield almost, right? It was a protective tool for a lot of businesses. Beyond that, I mean, I think we could go on and on about all the ways in which corruption hurts businesses, right? It hurts corporate culture. It erodes, employee confidence in their employers. It introduces uncertainty in business transactions. It's anti-competitive. And it's not a victimless crime, right? You can sort of imagine all the things and we've seen it play out, right, in these enforcement actions that have been brought. You have everything from highways that collapse or hospital that now has faulty medical equipment, right? Because there was a government contract somewhere that was given to a company that was willing to pay bribes. So I mean, there are lots of reasons for why ultimately, I think the executive order is sort of ignoring some of the many reasons for why the FCPA was actually very helpful to U.S. businesses. Practically speaking, what does all of this mean, right? So I think there are sort of a few things that is sort of that are important for all of us to remember, right? Given this pause in enforcement. The first is that there's a pause in enforcement, but the law itself is still on the books, right? That's really important. The FCPA has not been repealed. Bribery is still illegal. And that's important to remember, especially because the statute of limitations for FCPA violations, right, is longer than any one administration. We're looking at 5 years plus. Often that period can be extended, right, if you're bringing, let's say, a conspiracy charge, for example. So, I think companies really need to take sort of a longer view here on this and realize that, the next administration may take a very different view. And even now, right, we have a 180-day pause. We don't really know sort of what's going to come out at the end of that pause, right? So I think that's one thing that's important to remember. The other thing that I'll just sort of emphasize, and we're sort of seeing this, we saw this play out even in the last week or so, is that, other jurisdictions also have their own anti-corruption laws on the books. And so and those laws are not subject to any kind of pause in enforcement. So if you're a company that's doing business in multiple jurisdictions, as many companies are, right, you may very well be subject to those laws as well. And, given this pause in FCP enforcement, what we predict we'll see, and we're actually already seeing this, is that regulators in other parts of the world are going to step in and try to fill this void, right? So just, March 20th, last week, authorities in the UK, Switzerland, and France they issued a statement reinforcing their commitment to tackling corruption and bribery, including through the creation of an international prosecutorial task force. The statement itself was sort of fairly short, but I think the message behind it was really important because I think it really reiterated that, look, other regulators are watching. They're noticing what's going on in the United States. And so, they're going to come together to kind of fill this void, right? Including by, and some of this is in the statement itself, right? Coming together to share information about best practices, right? What are ways in which we can work together in a more effective way, especially where you have, multi-jurisdictional investigations, right? So, and the statement also provides that they're going to be inviting agencies from other parts of the world, right, that may be interested in fighting corruption to join this effort. So, again, I think it's really important to note that while it used to be the case that the FCPA was sort of the model, right, that doesn't have to be the case. And since the enactment of the FCPA, other jurisdictions have enacted their own laws, and I think it may very well be the case that their regulators in other, countries are going to step up and try to fill this void, given this, pause in FCPA enforcement. And then one other point I'll make is that while the executive order doesn't actually say this, right, the focus is on the FCPA has hurt U.S. businesses, right? So if you sort of think through that, what that means, I think one possibility, we may see this playing out, is that going forward, the FCPA may be used really as a tool to go after non-US companies, right? So you can imagine, maybe a situation where you have, a US company loses out, to a government in a government tender process, loses out to, competitor from another country, right? You could see a situation where, the administration may be, willing to take a hard look at, okay, well, how did this other company win this contract, right? Was there some element of corruption, some element of bribery? And, shouldn't we try to bring some kind of investigation or enforcement action against this foreign company, right? So you could kind of see how the FCPA could almost be weaponized, right, or used as a tool to kind of drive home this, idea of America first, right? This America first policy and this concept of, economic, securities, national security, which again is taking a narrow view of we're focused on what seems to be good for US businesses, right? So again, I do think that for non-US companies, it's important to sort of watch the space because I think the suspension may mean something different for them than it does for US businesses.
Yeah, those are great points, Shrutih. And I think the weaponization of this policy is a corruption, if you will, of the intention of it. So I think we could probably spend an hour just talking about the history of FCPA and all the changes right now. But let's keep it moving here. And Bob, I want to turn it over to you, and I want to talk about the relationship with our allies. And Bob, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about relationships, right? As a CIA case officer, relationships are what it's all about, connection, right? And I can't imagine that watching, what's transpired in over the last couple months with this new administration has been anything but upsetting for somebody like you, who's obviously invested a career in building relationships. But two things. I'm hoping you might take us kind of behind the scenes and give us a sense of what this means from an intelligence perspective. We're hearing a lot about how allies are going to be, maybe sharing less intelligence because somebody like Tulsi Gabbard is not the director of national intelligence, is not considered a reliable person. So if you could kind of get beyond the headlines for us and give us a little bit more of a granular sense of what that looks like, we'd appreciate that. And then also, in case anybody has been kind of hiding under a rock this week, The Atlantic has dropped some bombshell stories about the editor of The Atlantic being included in a chat with national security officials. It's been all over the news. Bob, I'd love to invite you to comment on that too. You're the former head of the Counterterrorism Center, senior intelligence official. If you could talk about both those subjects for us, everybody would be really grateful.
Okay, let me try to do that briefly. And as you point out, Jeremy, personal relations are extremely important in all of this, and those are relationships that are built up over time, and they're based on trust. And in my experience, when people talk about the special relationship, for instance, between the U.S. and the U.K., it really does exist. And and in that context, there are very, very close personal relationships of trust that grow up over time. But underlying all of that is the belief that the information that you share in the context of that relationship is going to be used in ways that accord with your interests as well. And I think of something that Winston Churchill is reputed to have said. He said that the U.S. was an imperial power in the best sense of the word, that they see their interests not in narrow terms, but in very broad terms. We have this commitment, as we were talking about before, in the United States to maintain a regime in the world that we think benefits all and perhaps us disproportionately, and therefore so much of the information that we acquire is designed to help us to maintain that regime. The British, obviously, for many generations now, have not had the kind of power on the world stage that they once had or that the U.S. enjoys right now. And yet, interestingly, just sort of like a hangover of their imperial past, they have tended to see their interests in very broad terms, very much like the terms in which the U.S. sees them, which opens up areas for cooperation that are qualitatively different than what has existed between us, for instance, and the French or the Germans, as benign as those relationships have been since World War II. So I think that's a very, very important consideration. And so if you think about the ways in which that has now changed, if, for instance, sharing information with regard to Russia, the tacit assumption has always been that information that our British friends, and I have no idea what British intelligence sharing is like now, but I can tell you that back in the day, they always tended to punch above their weight, particularly with regard to Russia. But if there is not a confidence on their part that information with regard to Russia, for instance, that they share with us is going to be used in ways that also broadly accord with their interests, they're not going to want to share that information. So that's an extremely important consideration, and I'm not sure if I've touched on the parts of that you would like or that people find interesting, and maybe we can get into a little bit more granular detail if you'd like to go there. But in the meantime, let me pick up on what you just mentioned with regard to what's sometimes being referred to now as Signalgate. And there were so many fascinating things that came out of that text exchange. But one of the things that particularly interested me was where J.D. Vance at one point, as they're contemplating the possibility of striking targets in Yemen in order to maintain freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, he says, well, why are we doing this? I mean, look, the president says it's America first. We have 3% of U.S. trade, which goes through that area. 40% of European trade goes through that area. Now, why are we doing this exactly? And so, it was pointed out very quickly by others, well, we got to do it because nobody else can. Nobody else has the strike capabilities that we have. And so it was also brought up on, I think it was by Stephen Miller, that, okay, fine, we can go ahead and do this, but we need to be thinking in terms of what price we're going to extract from the Europeans if we're going to go ahead. And that raises this much larger issue we touched on before, and that is that if we are going to continue to make our capabilities available to Europeans and others for reasons that don't immediately redound to our credit, what's the price that we're going to extract here? And we could speculate a lot about what that might look like.
Yeah, I could also easily spend quite a bit more time trying to unpack the Signalgate as you referred to it. Really just shocking stuff. And I think that's a great point also, that one of the big takeaways is how it shows the disdain that it shows for our allies. That was very clear in there as well, and as if that needed to be exacerbated at this moment too. Crazy stuff. Shruti, I want to talk to you about tariffs. Tariffs are all over the news. It's being discussed widely. I'm hoping this is another area where maybe you can get under the hood here. I have a lot of different analogies, granular, talking about these things. Let's use that one, under the hood here, for this one. And I'm going to ask you to break out your crystal ball a little bit too. What are your thoughts on the current situation with tariffs? Every day we look at the press, and we find that there's some new detail about tariffs coming up. He's going to, not allow tariffs on cars. He is going to allow them. So talk to us a little bit about tariffs. And before I get you to start answering that question, I would like to ask everybody to consider if you have a question. And if you do, please put it in the Q&A. There's a button you can push to put a question there. We usually try to wrap these discussions up by about 15 minutes to the hour, but this is such a fascinating discussion that I could already see we'll probably go close to the hour, but we will try to get to as many questions as we can. But Shruti, if you could tell us a little bit about the tariff situation, we would all appreciate that.
Sure. So, I mean, as you've said, Jeremy, this administration is really relying on tariffs as a key tool to bring, at least again from the administration's perspective, right, to bring trading partners to the negotiating table. And I think there are a few things that really stand out about the ways in which tariffs are being used by the administration that I think are really novel, right? And I think that are sort of important to keep in mind as we're all trying to navigate this landscape. The first is that, the tariffs are being used to really address a wide range of issues. And many of them have nothing to do really with, economic policy, or, the trade deficit. I mean, that is certainly part of it, right? That's part of the discussion. But at least sort of on the face, right, that there are lots of reasons that are being provided by the administration, by President Trump, for some of these tariffs, right? Ranging from, they're being used to address the fentanyl crisis, to the migration crisis, to, we're using it to impose secondary tariffs, and we'll talk about that in a minute, right, against Venezuela, because of, violent, the fact that they've allowed, violent gangs to keep operating in the United States. So, you could debate whether or not these reasons are pretextual or not. But again, at least sort of outwardly, we're really seeing sort of tariffs being used as a tool to really address a very wide range of issues, which I think is really novel. And I think maybe kind of building on that, part of sort of what's novel about these tariffs is that is also the way in which they're being imposed, right? So President Trump has been using, and I think will continue to use, a statute. It's a statute called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEPA, as we sort of generally refer to it, to impose tariffs. And what's really interesting is that no president before President Trump has used this statute to impose tariffs, right? It's an emergency statute, emergency law that essentially allows the president to take various actions in response to a national emergency. So far, it's really primarily been used as a sanctions statute, right, to impose sanctions on foreign adversaries, governments, entities, individuals, as well as in some instances to impose export controls. But it's never really been used to impose tariffs. And so I think there's a question out there in the legal community as to, can this statute even be used for this purpose, right? And the reason for why, it appears President Trump is relying on this statute and seems to like it so much is that, there are other laws, right, that the administration can rely on, sort of traditional tariff authorities, which are also relying on to some extent, right? But those laws generally require that, some kind of administrative process be followed before the tariffs can be imposed, right? Usually what it means is the Department of Commerce or the United States Trade Representative has to engage in, an investigation, right? To assess whether or not tariffs are, justified or necessary. And the use of this IEPA statute, right, that bypasses that whole process. Essentially, with the stroke of a pen, the president can pass an executive order relying on the statute and just, impose tariffs, and you kind of bypass that entire administrative process. And so it really kind of, allows not just swift action, but also, acting really, without input from other federal agencies that kind of have a pulse, have their finger on the pulse in terms of, okay, what's really going on with the economy? What's really going on with our trading partners, right? Is this really hurting, U.S. business, U.S. national security? You're kind of bypassing all of that. You're not getting that input. And the president is essentially just able to act unilaterally, right? And so we haven't really seen this so far, but I think as time goes on, I think it's very likely that there will be legal challenges that will be brought against these tariffs because they're relying on this statute. And I think that there's an argument to be made that, reliance on the statute is potentially an overreach of presidential powers, right? That this is not how the statute was meant to be used. It doesn't use the word tariffs anywhere, right? And that this is not the proper use for it. And then the last thing I'll just sort of, kind of hit on, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about, future outlook. But, we saw this with the secondary tariffs, right, that are being discussed in terms of, what may happen with Venezuela, right, where, on or after April 2nd, we may now see tariffs imposed on all goods imported into the U.S. from any country that imports Venezuelan oil, right? So this is really, it's a novel concept. This concept of secondary tariffs. It's really a sanctions concept, right? So in the context of trade sanctions, the United States has, under many sanctions programs, imposed restrictions, prohibitions, sanctions on non-U.S. parties that engage in trade with or engage in transactions with, sanctioned persons, sanctioned governments. Right. So, for example, under the Iran sanctions program, right, even non-U.S. companies or non-U.S. Persons can face sanctions if they engage in certain types of transactions involving Iran. But this is not really a concept that we've seen before in the tariff context. So I think it's sort of very, there are lots of novel uses for tariffs that are being deployed by this administration. And I think it really, as time goes on, and I think especially as companies and trade associations, right, sort of see how this is going to play out over the long run. I think given the economic impact that some of this can have, I think it's likely that we'll see litigation challenging some of these tariffs.
Well, I was actually going to circle back to that very point after I thanked you because, I learned a lot just now. I didn't really know much about secondary sanctions and a bunch of things. So you've given us a lot to think about. I won't ask you to respond to this because of the position that you're in at a major law firm, but I wonder if anybody will be around to challenge these tariffs, as you alluded to, with the way that the administration is going after prominent law firms, and sadly, the way some prominent law firms have given ground to the administration. So again, don't want to put you on the spot there, Shruti. It's a difficult environment for the legal community right now. We're starting to get some great questions in, so I do want to get to those, and I do have a couple more questions I'm hoping to briefly ask Bob and Shruti as well. But Bob, I just want to give you one more before I start taking some of the questions. I think we'd be really remiss to have the former head of the CTC on here who spent a career, in part focused on the war on terrorism. I'd love to just get you to comment on the situation, as always, kind of a little bit crazy in the Middle East. It's so broad. You could comment on any number of things: Israel, Gaza, Yemen, Iran, Syria. Could you break off any little piece of the craziness going on in the Middle East and give us a sense of what maybe you're not seeing is widely reported, or a perspective that you have that hasn't been widely out there?
Well, I don't know if whether or not it's been widely out there, but I can just share a few surface impressions that I have. And you mentioned the Middle East in the context of terrorism. In recent decades, at least since 9/11, when we're talking about terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere, we've been sort of focusing on subnational groups. Al Qaeda, ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the threat from those now is small and is ever diminishing. In some ways, I see the region, kind of going back to, something which much more looks like the past, in that the violence is being perpetrated primarily by states or or state-like groups, and in that I would include both the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has effective control over Lebanon, rather than these subnational groups. And the only other sort of broad thing that I will say, again, I think it's a fairly obvious one, is that the aftermath of October 7th has created a very, very different power dynamic in the region. It had appeared to many, including myself, that the power of Hezbollah put it in a position where an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah, for instance, would be something that both would be equally motivated to avoid. Turned out that Hezbollah's missile capability was very much overestimated, and Hezbollah is in a qualitatively much weaker position than it was vis-a-vis Israel before. Same with Iran. That creates opportunities, and ones which I would anticipate the U.S. trying to exploit, particularly in the context of Iran and its nuclear program, under circumstances where, at least for the time being, we don't have to worry nearly as much about a malevolent Iranian policy in the context of its so-called proxies around the region. So I would just say, particularly with regard to Iran, we should all watch that space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a question on China, and I think that would be great to hear from both of you on some broader views on China. The question specifically is whether war is inevitable with China. And I'm going to just jump in because I've spent a lot of my career on China too, and offer just a quick thought or two that I don't think so. I'll get this wrong, but there was a meme of sorts on The Onion a while ago. I think, Bob, you might be familiar with it in particular, about how something like Al-Qaeda sits back and watches America destroy itself, that kind of thing, instead of planning an attack. And I think that's China's view right now, watching as its, main antagonist on the global stage is just, sort of destroying itself and its allies as it tries to change. No matter how you feel about this administration, there's been a lot of just craziness going on. I think what's going on in the South China Sea, there's a ton of China's Navy and Coast Guard challenging people in the Philippines and Japan and Vietnam. So that's a flashpoint. I don't know if the U.S. would go to war to defend any of them there, but the Philippines in particular, where they put Typhoon missiles and other capabilities. So I would watch that. I don't view war with China as inevitable, but I would love to hear what you think, both of you, and Shrutih in particular, if you would comment, and maybe we can start with you on global business and China as well. Would love to get both of your views.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, Jeremy. I think, I think an actual war is unlikely, but I think what we will likely see is sort of a tightening of legal restrictions, right, in terms of doing business with China. And so, what does that mean? And we've already seen this play out, frankly, over the last, during the first Trump administration, and then even under President Biden. But I think we can expect a further tightening of, U.S. export controls, potential sanctions on China, and that's actually something that's set forth in one of the administration's policy memoranda. Is that we haven't really seen extensive sanctions on China so far, but I think that memorandum suggests that additional sanctions could actually be forthcoming. In addition, and we can talk about this a little bit more if we want to get into CFIUS, right? But I think that there will also be a tightening, and this is set forth in the America First investment policy that President Trump has released. I think we're very likely to see a tightening of restrictions in terms of both inbound and outbound investments into China. And we'll also, and I think getting into talking, I think earlier we were talking about secondary tariffs and secondary sanctions, right? That America First investment policy also talks about, on the one hand, we want to help our allies that want to invest in the U.S., but only, right, and this is sort of the trick here, only if they're willing to decrease their dependence, their reliance on China, decrease their own investment into China. And so, how is that actually going to play out in reality and practicality? I think that remains to be seen. But I think that's sort of where the pressure is going to be, sort of using these international trade laws and these national security laws to try to, keep the pressure up, with respect to China. Will it work or not? I think that's something that, remains to be seen. And I think scholars and, lawyers in the space kind of debate that regularly. But I do think that that's coming, and the administration has sort of given every indication of that already so far.
Thanks, Shruti. Bob, I know that China hasn't been where you focused your career, but I know from conversations with you how, you have an interesting perspective on it as well. Could you share some thoughts on what you're thinking about with China and what, maybe the next few years might look like?
Yeah. I am transparently opposed to some of the policies that appear to be currently pursued by this administration with regard to both Russia and China. And I think if we look at what we could describe as a very tolerant attitude toward major powers who are practicing repression at home and aggressive action abroad, in our tolerating that sort of behavior and in a sense ceding to them zones of influence, one of the positive things potentially you could say about that is that it would appear to lessen the possibility of war and possibly accelerating to a nuclear war. One of the real hazards, obviously, in imposing or in trying to oppose Russian policy in Ukraine, in an area where they see a potentially existential threat to themselves, is that in trying to deal with that perception of existential threat, they are much more likely to get into a general war with the West. That would not be a particularly good thing for us. Similarly, in East Asia, and I'll defer to you entirely on this, Jeremy. You've forgotten more about China than I'm ever going to know. But I do believe that Xi Jinping, in looking at Taiwan, and he says that eventually we're going to take Taiwan, in effect, one way or another. I think he's absolutely serious about that. And when you compare the attitude of the current administration with that of, for instance, Biden, who, as I interpret it, went well beyond the position that any of his predecessors were willing to take, at least overtly. He was saying, in effect, as I understood him, that he was willing to go to war in defense of Taiwan. Quite frankly, it's hard for me to imagine circumstances under which Donald Trump would go to war with China in order to preserve the sovereignty of Taiwan or freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. I may be entirely wrong about that, and you may see this differently. But it seems to me that the positive thing you could say about that is that it lessens at least the immediate possibility of nuclear war.
Yep. Well said. I appreciate that. We're getting a little bit towards the finish line here, so I want to encourage Bob and Shruti. These, maybe we'll call these more of lightning round answers so that we can get to a couple of the questions from the audience. And I just have two more that I definitely want to ask you too. I'll intersperse them with some of the questions coming in from the audience. And Shruti, I think you're in a great position to educate all of us on a rather esoteric part of American trade policy known as CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. I wonder if you could briefly describe what CFIUS is. I know that you've told me about reverse CFIUS, which I didn't know anything about. So with an emphasis on being somewhat brief so that we can get to a little bit more before the hour, could you talk a little bit about CFIUS, reverse CFIUS, and what it means for American trade right now, please?
Sure. So CFIUS it's an interagency committee chaired by the Department of Treasury. And, very broadly speaking, it has the authority to review a wide range of investments that are made by foreign investors into U.S. businesses. It used to be the case that CFIUS's jurisdiction was, fairly narrow, and so as a result, it was a regulator that was fairly inactive, right, until about 2018 or so. But at that point in 2018, and from then onwards, CFIUS's jurisdiction has been expanded. I won't get into all of the details, but just as a result of that, CFIUS now really has a much broader mandate and is able to look at a wide range of investments that are made into U.S. companies by foreign parties. And in some instances, parties have to make a filing with CFIUS, essentially have to get CFIUS permission to engage in to proceed with the investment. And in other instances, even where a filing is not mandatory, CFIUS on its own volition, if it has jurisdiction, right, can ask to review a transaction, or sometimes parties can voluntarily file with CFIUS, and then CFIUS will either clear the transaction or they can block it, or alternatively, they can allow it to proceed, but with certain mitigation measures that CFIUS believes are important to address certain national security concerns that in CFIUS's view underline, that investment. So that's sort of, very broadly speaking, what CFIUS is. The focus with respect to CFIUS in the past, few years has really been on China, right? So on Chinese investments that are being made in U.S. businesses. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that is going to be sort of where a lot of the focus will continue to be, right? So in the America First investment policy that President Trump released, there are a few changes with respect to CFIUS that are highlighted. The first is that on the one hand, we want to have a fast track review for investments that are made from allied countries. At the same time, we want to make it much more difficult for investors from foreign adversaries, and that certainly includes China, also includes Russia, Iran, North Korea, the Venezuela, right under the Maduro regime. We want to make it much more difficult for investors from those countries to invest in the U.S. economy. So that's kind of how we can see that playing out. And then just very, very quickly on reverse CFIUS, this is essentially, it's a new outbound investment program that the U.S. has adopted this year. It's still somewhat narrow at the moment. Under this program, parties are prohibited in some instances, and in others are required to notify Treasury regarding certain investments that are made in 3 different industries: semiconductors and microelectronics, quantum information technologies, and artificial intelligence in countries of concern. That term is currently defined to only include China and Hong Kong and Macau, but we think it's very likely that that's going to include a list of additional countries going forward. So in any case, that's what reverse CFIUS is. It's essentially putting restrictions on, and in some instances, prohibitions on U.S. investments that are made in certain sectors of the Chinese economy.
Thank you so much for that, Shruti. Bob, there's a question to address specifically to you that I would love to hear you answer briefly as well. Kind of a two-parter that, what do you believe is the biggest security threat to the U.S. today? And also, what do you believe the future of counterterrorism looks like in the age of decentralized non-state actors?
Yeah, boy, the greatest threat. I think that our perception and our assessments of the greatest threat, as we've seen that perception evolve over time, is very much dependent on the way that we see our national interests. So, at a certain time, we would, for very natural reasons, have thought that Russia was our greatest threat. Nuclear armed power, hostile to U.S. interests. We've now with the general diminishing of Russian power overall, though they still maintain a very large nuclear capability. Now that concern is tended to shift toward China. You mentioned about the second part of your question having to do with counterterrorism, our concern with subnational groups. I remember, other people wouldn't, but I remember before 9/11 when George Tenet gave the briefing to Congress that we just saw occur over the past 2 days, trying to assess the threat profile around the world. He came out and said that he thought the greatest threat to U.S. national security was Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. I thought he was crazy at the time, by the way. He turned out that he understood some things that I failed to fully appreciate at the time. So that's a very long way of saying, quite frankly, I'm not really quite sure how we should assess our current threats, because I'm not really sure the way in which the administration, at least, is going to see our interests going forward. So I would see that as being very fluid at the moment. And at the risk of repeating the mistake that I was prepared to make back before 9/11, again, at least in the current context, I don't see sort of a violent extremism pursued by subnational groups as being a growing threat right now. If anything, I see it as being a diminishing threat, particularly relative to us.
Thanks, Bob. I hope that that's true. I think, lone wolves remain are a huge threat, but yeah, I hope that you're right there. We're getting very close to the finish line here, so this might be our last question. And Shruti, it comes over to you, and it builds off of the phrase you used earlier that economic security is national security. There's an attendee that posed this that was wondering that does the deficit pose a long-term risk to U.S. security? And do you believe, it might be a little bit of conspiracy talk here, but do you think that some of the tariff talk and the generation of instability is about kind of causing a chance to perhaps refinance that looming debt at a better rate? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to sort of, provide that kind of, economic outlook, but I think I think that the trade deficit is definitely it's a problem that needs to be addressed. I think the issue with, will the tariff sort of help with this is I think there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the tariffs. And I think, frankly, the effect that it will have on the US economy, I think is in some ways very difficult to predict precisely because it is so uncertain, right? The tariffs are on one day, they're off the next. Oh, now we're going to, negotiate with the trading partner, and so actually this is going to look very different. I think it's very difficult to say at this point in time, will these tariffs actually help, right? The other point that I'll just add is I think the tariffs sort of, and especially, given the tariffs that have been threatened against trading partners with whom we have, trade agreements, right? They sort of hurt the US's credibility, right? So on the one hand, you're trying to negotiate with a trading partner. On the other hand, right, the thinking could be, well, we already had an agreement in place, right? What happened to that? And so if you're not willing to honor that commitment, what's to say that this negotiation will be fruitful? So I mean, I think certainly that is at least a stated, goal of some of these tariffs is that they're supposed to help with, reduction in the trade deficit. But I think just given all the uncertainty that they're introducing, I think the U.S. and, the hit to the U.S. economy that I do think is in some ways inevitable. I think we're gonna have to see how it turns out in the long run, but certainly in the short term, I think the uncertainty is actually hurting, is potentially more harmful than it is helpful.
Yeah, I'll say I agree with you
Mhm.
there. And I want to thank both of you so much, Shruti and Bob. This has been terrific. As suspected, I think we could go on and on with this discussion. We're so lucky to have your expertise with us today. So thank you so much for being with us. I enjoyed it. I'm going to turn it over to Don Aviv, CEO of Interfor International.
Thanks again to Bob and
Mhm.
Shruti and Jeremy. Great session. Learned a lot. Also troubled even more going forward, but I think that's a sign of the times. Let's track this closely. And just a reminder to everyone that on April 24th we'll have Anthony Scaramucci on to discuss private equity in the VC world and the outlook looking forward into the rest of the year. So thanks again to everyone for joining us around the world.